So the first sort of experimental evidence for Pape circuit involvement in emotional expression was a bilateral, that means on both sides of the brain, temporal lobectomy, so removal of large portions of the temporal lobe in monkeys, actually by Kluver-Bucy in Germany. And these were pretty grim experiments, obviously. And the result of the removal of large portions of the Pape circuit, including the hippocampus, right, the medial temporal lobe, portions of the ventral and inferotemporal lobes, that are important for object recognition, right, resulted in pretty severe, emotional disruptions. Kluver-Bucy reported a lack of affect, and affect is a term for emotional expression, right? And they had far less affect. In fact, Kluver-Bucy wrote about how these monkeys, and they use this term, this is not my quote, but this is their quote, but that the monkeys were vicious, is what they said. And then after the surgery, they were not. And so they had no real emotional responsiveness. They had a lack of affect. They also had visual agnosia, and agnosia, A means none, and gnosis is knowledge. So they had no knowledge of what objects that they were looking at, visually. And this has a lot to do, obviously, with the removal of the what pathway, in visual processing in the temporal lobes. They removed all those inferotemporal regions that are important for face recognition and other object recognition. And clearly they were not able to, recognize objects visually anymore. And then they also had severe sort of memory impairments, and that's also due largely to temporal lobe removal, right? You're taking out medial temporal regions that are essential for the transfer of ongoing experience into longer term memory stores, the medial temporal lobe areas like the hippocampus, for example. They also had indiscriminate sexual expression. They would sort of cycle in terms of sexual activity. They would mount things indiscriminately. And this used to confuse me when I heard, there's a lack of affect, but they're indiscriminately expressing sort of sexual actions. And, part of it is the idea was that a lot of the kind of context-specific, wiring from, frontal lobe regions over, hypothalamic, sort of expression of these drives, sexual drives, for example, had been damaged, had been lost, actually, with this, wholesale sort of bilateral temporal lobectomy, so that the drives were being generated, but there was no sort of, social context that was being sort of applied. There was no inhibition of those drives or, adjustment of those drives. They would just sort of cycle, over, certain periods. So anyway, this was the first experimental evidence, grisly evidence, actually, for Pape circuit involvement in kind of emotional expression.